So, here's the scoop. The Supreme Court just turned down President-elect Donald Trump's last-minute attempt to pause his sentencing in the hush money case. In a tight vote of 5-4, they denied his emergency request to hold off the sentencing scheduled for Friday. He got convicted in New York for trying to cover up payments made to an adult film performer. Interestingly, it was two conservative judges who teamed up with three liberal ones to put a stop to Trump's delay request. Now, Trump had quite a lot to say about the decision. He jumped in with a serious tone, making it clear that this is not just a rumor or a speculative tweet. According to him, the United States is facing a live, unprecedented constitutional crisis. His lawyers are planning to appeal the ruling, even though the judge pointed out there's no real penalty involved. Trump feels it's a bit of a disgrace, claiming the judge shouldn't have been on this particular case due to conflicts of interest. He also mentioned he thought the ruling was actually fair and is gearing up to address it in his own way come tomorrow. In a surprising twist, the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, found himself stuck on the tarmac of Palm Beach International Airport, unable to leave the country thanks to federal law enforcement. It really makes you ponder what happens when the most powerful person in the world decides court orders don't apply to him. Who shows up to address that situation? It's certainly a first in American history, and you can sense that we're heading into uncharted waters. And that's where things get a bit complex. The mainstream media isn't covering it as thoroughly as you might think, not because it's not important, but because the full story involves layers of legal intricacies that are tough to sum up in quick headlines. But don't worry, we're here to break down every aspect of it. This one truly matters, so stick around for the details. Earlier today, a federal courtroom was the stage for a dramatic moment. Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein delivered a powerful ruling that really shook things up, the kind of ruling that leaves no room for debate. He firmly rejected Trump's final attempt to escape the consequences of 34 felony convictions tied to the hush money case in New York. But it wasn't just a firm no. The judge had a warning that could be heard all the way to the White House. He touched on Trump's continuous delays and refusal to follow court orders, stating that he was considering holding the president in contempt of court. That was about as serious as it gets. Just to add to the chaos, it's important to note that federal judges across the country are running out of patience. They're slapping down orders, setting deadlines, and even hinting at fines or jail time for non-compliance. They're getting increasingly frustrated because the Trump administration, across numerous cases, seems to be disregarding court orders as if they don't matter. It's almost as if they believe the judicial system is more of a suggestion than a requirement. A troubling thought, especially when you realize this issue extends beyond just immigration policies or deportation flights. At its core, what's really at stake here is whether our courts still hold any power at all. If the executive branch can simply ignore judges whenever it suits them, it raises serious questions about the rule of law and accountability in our democracy. This situation is still unfolding and has the potential to change everything. When we start letting things slide without any consequences, it feels like we're not really operating under three branches of government anymore. Instead, it seems like we've got just one branch, the one that has all the guns, planes, and agents. Now, before we go any further, I need to make something clear. Trump has not been arrested. There wasn't any dramatic scene at the airport with federal agents stopping Air Force One. That's just a viral story floating around on social media, and I'm not here for that. What we're going to focus on is something far more significant. We're going to walk through the real legal mechanisms in place that could apply if a federal court were to issue a contempt warrant against someone in this administration. It's important to understand what the law actually states, and we're really examining whether the system still has the strength to enforce itself. Here's the truly wild part. The legal framework for holding a president or his top officials in contempt, it's been around since 1789. The existence of that power isn't the question. The real question is whether anyone is brave enough to wield it. Right now, a few federal judges are starting to find out what happens when they do. Take one judge in Minnesota, for instance. This guy was appointed by George W. Bush, not exactly a liberal activist or a Biden judge. He took the time to list out 96 separate court orders that ICE had violated across 74 different cases. He went on to say something pretty stunning, and I'm just going to paraphrase here. He couldn't recall another instance in the history of the United States where a federal court had repeatedly threatened contempt just to make the government follow the law. Those are his words coming from a Bush appointee regarding the current administration. Can you believe it? This isn't about left versus right. It's a conservative judge stating the rule of law is in serious trouble, and he's not the only one thinking this way. We're going to dive into all of that. Once you get a grasp on how contempt really works, what the U.S. Marshals can do, and what the actual legal trap looks like, you'll begin to see the whole situation in a new light. So, let's get started from the very beginning, because there are quite a few people out there who might not fully understand how this all operates. The federal court system has been around since the year 1789, and it's jaw-dropping when you really dig into how it was set up from the start. The way things are today is pretty concerning when you look beneath the surface. Right from the first session of Congress, lawmakers included an important enforcement tool for the courts known as contempt of court. Basically, if someone ignores a court order, the court can take action. This can involve fines, sanctions, and in more serious situations, even jail time. As the Supreme Court put it, this power is vital to the authority of the courts. Without the ability to enforce court orders, those orders are just pieces of paper, decorative and meaningless. A legal system that doesn't empower its orders is just putting on a show, really. Now, you might wonder who actually makes sure contempt orders are enforced. That's where the U.S. Marshals come into play. Most folks might not know much about them. They aren't the FBI or the CIA and definitely don't get the same Hollywood attention. But interestingly enough, they're the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the U.S., created in the very same year as the courts. It's not just a tradition. The law specifically establishes that the U.S. Marshals' main job is to enforce all federal court orders. That's pretty clear-cut. So, when a federal judge decides someone needs to be held accountable and issues a contempt order, it's the marshals who step in. They're the ones who carry out the warrant and handle the arrest if it comes to that. But things get a bit tricky when we consider the current situation in 2026. You see, the marshals are part of the Justice Department and operate under the Attorney General's direction. This means that, in theory, a president who has control over the Attorney General could also influence what the marshals do or don't do day to day. Right now, we're really seeing this intense clash between the courts and the executive branch, where the courts are trying to enforce their orders while the executive has control over the enforcers. It's almost like a high-stakes game happening in real time across courtrooms in the country. Let's dive into some specific cases because, honestly, the details tell the story way better than any dry explanation could. So, back in early 2026, the Trump administration kicked off something called Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota. They sent thousands of ICE agents flooding into the state all at once, leading to mass arrests, rapid detentions, and deportation processes that had the courts struggling just to keep up. Even judges, including Chief Judge Patrick Schiltz, who was appointed by Bush, found ICE was breaking court orders. This wasn't just a slip-up. It happened 96 times across 74 cases, and Schiltz didn't just shake his head and move on. Nope, he threatened criminal contempt against those involved. We're talking about serious stuff here, not a fine where you just go home, but potential jail time. This meant that federal officials, those guys with badges and government jobs, could actually end up behind bars for ignoring a judge's order. Once that possibility was put on the table, the administration backed off in that particular instance. But Schiltz wasn't finished yet. He was very clear in his ruling that the court had been extremely patient with the government. He pointed out that they had tried lesser measures before, but those hadn't worked. He promised right there on the record that if it happened again, he would do whatever it took to uphold the rule of law. Those were some powerful words from a federal judge about the sitting administration. Definitely not something you hear every day. Then there's this wild case coming from Washington, D.C. This one's even more of a nail-biter. Federal Judge James Boasberg found that the Trump administration had intentionally ignored his order concerning the deportation of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador. They used the Alien Enemies Act to send away over 200 people who had active court orders protecting them from being kicked out. Plus, They rushed those deportation flights before Boasberg could intervene with a stop order. Can you imagine? The planes were already in the air when they pulled that move. Boasberg was really clear in his ruling, stating that the Constitution doesn't allow officials, especially those who've promised to uphold it, to just ignore judicial orders. He mentioned that letting this kind of defiance slide would turn the Constitution into a joke, which is pretty striking language coming from a federal judge discussing the current administration. It's quite something to digest, but here's the kicker. Very few people are talking about this crucial detail, which might just be the most important part of the whole situation. Trump's allies on the appeals court, the very judges he appointed, jumped in to freeze Boasberg's investigation into contempt. They raised a question about whether Boasberg even has the power to investigate contempt by himself, or if he has to pass it over to the Justice Department, the same department that works for Trump. Just think about the implications of that for a moment. If courts are unable to manage their own contempt proceedings and have to rely on the executive branch to decide whether to prosecute, then the executive branch would essentially be giving itself a free pass on judicial enforcement. So imagine this. You ignore a court order, you send the contempt referral to your own attorney general, and if she chooses not to prosecute, that's it. Nothing happens. The judge is left with no power. In fact, every court across the country would find itself powerless. Legal experts, including those who have been part of justice departments under both Republican and Democratic administrations, insist that if this argument succeeds, it could create a permanent loophole. This would allow the president and his team to conveniently bypass court orders without worrying about facing any consequences. A free pass for any court order at any time. This isn't just some far-fetched legal theory. It's practically a roadmap for avoiding accountability. Now let's connect the dots and break down the key points you really shouldn't miss out on. First, the legal trap is not just a concept. It's already being tested. The system designed to hold the executive branch in contempt isn't some academic discussion. It's been in place for over 200 years. Courts have used it against governors and cabinet members alike. Back in 2019, the Education Secretary got in big trouble for ignoring a court order about collecting student loans. Fast forward to 2022, and it was Trump's turn when a New York court slapped him with a civil contempt ruling, hitting him with a fine of $10,000 every day, which totaled $110,000 for not handing over documents. So, feeling contempt isn't exactly new in legal circles. What's really striking, though, is how widespread and consistent this defiance has been. One judge even remarked that in early 2026, records supposedly showed more violations of court orders in a single month by this administration than some federal agencies have done in their entire history. This wasn't just a case of making a few procedural blunders. It reflects a deliberate choice, which is a significant distinction when discussing matters of contempt and rule of law. Now let's dive into the role of the marshals, which gets a bit tricky. People often don't realize that U.S. Marshals are torn between two responsibilities. By law, they're bound to enforce all federal court orders. That's their main job. But they also work for the Department of Justice, headed by the Attorney General, who is appointed by the President. So, what happens when these two duties clash? Imagine a court issuing a warrant for a government official, but the Attorney General tells the marshals to stand down. It's a scenario that no one knows how to navigate because it's never happened at this level before. Legal experts are hashing it out right now, with some saying the marshal's duty to the court should come first, regardless of what the executive branch wants. But others argue that it's unrealistic to expect federal law enforcement to act against their own chain of command. A handful of serious legal minds are warning us, albeit quietly, that if we ever reach a point where a court issues a warrant and the marshals choose not to carry it out, we would be stepping into completely uncharted constitutional territory, an area that the founders didn't fully lay out for us. It's honestly hard to believe how we're seeing some pretty intense arguments coming out of Washington, D.C. right now. One of the things that really stands out to me is this idea from Trump's allies that judges shouldn't be able to conduct their own contempt investigations. Instead, they should just hand everything over to the Department of Justice. This isn't just about procedures. This is much deeper. It's a structural change that could seriously undermine the judiciary as an independent branch of our government. If that argument wins, it would essentially allow the executive branch to ignore court orders without worrying about any real consequences. Courts could write all the opinions and issue all the orders they want, but if the only ones who can enforce those orders are working for the person in contempt, then it creates a messed up cycle. The whole system would just collapse in on itself. And the fallout wouldn't just be limited to this administration. Every future president, whether they're a Democrat or a Republican or anything in between, would inherit this kind of immunity. Once that's in place, rolling it back would be nearly impossible. Now, onto something really important. This situation is already impacting real people right now. I think it's crucial to remember the human side of all this legal talk. Behind the court orders and constitutional debates are actual human beings, like immigrants being detained without warrants or folks who had active court protections, but still got deported. There are people sitting in prisons in El Salvador right now who shouldn't even be there, according to federal judges. When court orders stop being enforced and the system stops functioning properly, it's always the most vulnerable who suffer first. These are the people without lawyers, without resources, and without the ability to fight back in a system that was already tough to navigate. So, yes, while we're talking about constitutional law and the separation of powers, we're also dealing with the very real consequences for ordinary people when those safeguards disappear. Looking ahead, it's essential to think about where all of this leads. What are the realistic paths forward? It's important to be honest about the range of possibilities. Right now, in 2026, the state of our judicial system is more stressed than it's been in a really long time. Judges are doing everything they can to keep things from falling apart, using the tools they have at their disposal. Some of those tools are doing their job, while others are being undermined by higher courts. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether the system will hold up and whether the checks and balances that we've relied on will mean anything moving forward. We can imagine a few possible futures here. One scenario is a sort of careful dance where the courts keep pushing for compliance, and the administration plays along just enough to avoid a complete constitutional meltdown. They push things to the limit and then pull back at the last moment. It's exhausting and not great for anyone, but at least the system technically functions. Then there's the possibility of things escalating. At some point, the administration might decide it's time to confront the judiciary head-on instead of backing down. That would mean everyone's watching in real time to see if the public, Congress, and even the executive branch are ready to support the judiciary in enforcing its authority. That scenario keeps legal experts awake at night because it's so unpredictable. And honestly, the scariest situation of all is a slow erosion of judicial authority. This wouldn't be a big dramatic showdown with a moment you can highlight in history. Instead, it would look like a gradual ignoring of court orders by the administration. The fines might stay small, the consequences seem manageable, and slowly people would start to accept that courts can't enforce their will against the executive branch. This creeping realization is the most terrifying because you wouldn't have a clear moment to point to. It would just happen quietly and incrementally. By the time everyone acknowledges the crisis, the damage would already be done, and the precedent would have been set. There's a lot going on in the courts right now, with decisions being made case by case and hearing by hearing, and most folks will never be aware of it. I'm committed to keeping an eye on every single development and sharing what's really happening. I'll steer clear of the viral rumors, the watered-down narratives, or the corporate spins. We're here for the real story, and that's what this channel focuses on. If you want to stay updated, go ahead and subscribe, hit that bell, and join our newsletter. It's totally free, and the link is right in the description. Things are about to pick up speed in this story, and you'll definitely want to be in the loop. I'll catch you in the next one.